In this chapter, we're going to be taking a look at how to work with HTML tables in Dreamweaver 8. So pardon me for a few minutes here while I enter into beginning of the chapter lecture mode again, but this is some necessary background information to get us through the rest of the chapter. Now, originally, tables were intended to be used for displaying data in tidy rows and columns, mostly with text and numbers. But soon thereafter, people realized that you could also place images into tables and manipulate the behavior of the tables in such a way that you could lay out entire pages within them. After that, it became nearly impossible to spend more than 5 minutes surfing the web without running into a page layout that relied almost entirely on tables. And that's still pretty much the case today. In a nutshell, tables give you the ability to make your web pages look more like they came out of a page layout program like, say, Adobe InDesign or Quark Express. And you really won't find too many professionally made web pages out there today that aren't built with tables. So tables are one of those things that you really just need to learn, and you also really need to practice so that you can apply them to your own work. So over the course of the movies in this chapter, I'm going to be showing you how to insert tables onto your page, and then what you can do to change their properties, their characteristics, and appearance to make them work for you. Now, one last thing I'll mention about tables before we get started is that while tables are probably still the most commonplace design element used for laying out pages, there is a slowly building movement, although lately it's been gaining momentum, in the web design community to encourage web designers to primarily use cascading style sheets for laying out pages. Cascading style sheets offer the same results as tables and are more flexible, but they're a little more difficult to learn. We didn't cover using CSS for layouts in the previous chapter, but we will look at some of Dreamweaver's graphical layout tools in the next chapter that take advantage of some of this capabilities. These layout tools allow you to just drag and drop images and text anywhere on your page that you like. But I firmly believe that it's still important for you to have a good foundational understanding of tables before you start working with tools that do a lot of the work for you. So if you've never worked with tables before, or if your understanding of them is limited, you'll want to spend some time in this chapter before moving on to the next chapter. So, that said, let's get to work with tables. Before you start using tables to lay out your web pages, it's important to first understand the mechanics of working with them. And that involves knowing how to insert the tables in the first place, and then how to select different parts of the table, like its cells, rows, columns, and even the entire table itself. Once you've selected the part of the table that you need, then you can go in and use the Properties Inspector to modify that table's properties. So I'm just going to create a new blank page by clicking the HTML button here in the Start page. And again, if you don't have the Start page set to display each time, you can also just choose File, New, and click HTML and create from there. I'm not going to bother defining a site yet because I'm just using this blank page to show you how to select different areas of a table. In the next movie, we'll define a new site so we can actually work with some files. So let's first talk about inserting the table. And there are a couple of ways to do this in Dreamweaver. So let's first talk about inserting the table. And there are a couple of ways to do this in Dreamweaver, but probably the easiest way is to just come right up to the Insert bar under the Comments section here and just click the Insert Table button. This opens up the Table window where I can set up the initial properties of the table. Now by default, it's set up to have 3 rows and 3 columns. And I'll just leave those settings for now. Next, we have the table width setting. Tables can be either pixel-based or percentage-based, and we'll be looking at both types. But for this example, I'm going to leave this as a pixel-based table, and I'm going to make it 600 pixels wide. That way it'll be easier to see in this movie. I'm not going to change any of the other settings right now, and I'll just click OK to add it to the page. And there's my table. Now, first of all, earlier on in one of the previous chapters, I turned off the display of table widths in Dreamweaver. And you can find that option here under the visual aids. I unchecked table widths. And if you have it on, this is what you'll see when you insert your table onto your page. This is a feature of Dreamweaver that lets you see the width settings of your table and its columns, and it can be useful at times, but I've just found that it gets in my way most of the time, so I tend to just leave it off until I need it. And I suggest you do the same for now. One other thing I should mention before we get started, just in case your screen looks a little bit different from mine, is there are actually 3 different table modes you can use in Dreamweaver to view your tables. If you look under the View menu and go to Table Mode, by default, Standard Mode should be selected, but just in case you or someone else was tinkering with these modes, you might see something different. We have something called Expanded Tables Mode, And that's similar to the standards view, but it actually adds extra cell padding and table borders that are supposed to make editing the table a little bit easier. But I really don't like the way this looks because it doesn't give you an accurate representation of what your table is really going to look like. And it's not really that hard to get used to working with tables in standard mode, so I never really use this mode at all. But just in case your table looks really big for some reason, check under the table mode menu and make sure that you have it set to standard mode instead of expanded tables mode. We also have what's called layout mode, and we're going to be getting to this in the next chapter, so I'm not going to talk about this right now. So just for this chapter, just make sure that you have standard mode selected. So here's my table. And remember when we inserted it, we told it to have 3 rows and 3 columns, and it's set to 600 pixels. But bear in mind that once a table has been added to your page, it's never set in stone. You can always select the table and add more columns or rows, as well as remove columns and rows. But before you can do so, you'll need to know how to select certain sections of your table in order to change them. For instance, if I want to select this entire top row, I can just drag through the cells like this. You can tell they're selected because they have this black border around them. By dragging, I can also select single cells just by dragging slightly to the right. You can see when it highlights, you've got it selected. Or I can just select adjacent cells like this. And you can select columns in the same way, however you like. Now, that's easy enough when you're working with a completely empty table like this one here. But when there's actually content in your cells, it sometimes gets a little trickier to select them. Which brings up a great feature in Dreamweaver that was introduced in the previous version of this program, Dreamweaver MX 2004. Just notice that if I move my cursor to the left of the table, this red highlight appears around that top row, and my cursor turns into a black arrow that points to the right. If I click, that selects that entire row. That red border tells you exactly what you'll be selecting if you click. So I see the red border there, I click, there's that row. And the same thing works for columns. You can see that. And it also works for the entire table. If I put my cursor near the border of the table, you see it red around the entire table, and I can select the entire table. And if you're going to select the entire table this way, I just suggest you come in from the bottom of the table or from the right. You can select the entire table from the top as well, but it's sort of a weird region here because if you get just about to this point, you select the table, but if you get a little bit closer, you select the column. So it can be a little bit confusing there. Same thing for the left. You can select just the rows from there. So I suggest if you're going to select the entire table, just click along the bottom. And because this is Dreamweaver, there's yet another way to select cells, rows, or the entire table. If you recall, I mentioned earlier that the tag selector area down here displays the HTML tags for the section of the document that you're working on. Because I clicked inside of the table, I see the table tag, the table row tag, TR, and the tag for the specific cell that I clicked in, which is TD, which stands for table data. That's how you write a table cell in HTML. So notice if I click TD, it selects that entire cell. If I click TR, it selects the row that cell is in, and table, of course, selects the entire table. So if you ever want to quickly select the table and you're having trouble clicking on the borders, just click anywhere in that table, click the table tag, and you've got the whole table selected. Now, why am I showing you all these different ways of selecting cells and rows and columns and tables? Well, depending on what you have selected, you'll see different things down here in your Properties Inspector. So once you have the desired section of your table selected, you can come down here and start deciding what you want to do. For instance, I mentioned earlier that you're not locked into the original number of rows and columns you selected when you first inserted the table. So with my table selected, I can see selections for number of rows and number of columns, and I can change that. But if I don't have the right thing selected, like if I'm only clicked into a cell, I see text properties here and cell properties down here. But nowhere in here do I see properties for the entire table. So I want to make sure I have my table selected if I want to come in here and say add another row. I'll add another 3 rows and change that to 6. And what that actually did is it added 3 new rows to the bottom of the table. Let me press Control-Z, Command-Z on the Mac, just undo that for a moment. So just so you get an idea, I'll just put some text in here. Now I'll add those rows again by selecting the table. And you can see I added the rows to the bottom right there. Same thing if I wanted to add some columns. Select the table again, add another 2 columns. like so, and you can see it adds that to the right. So anytime you use the Properties Inspector to add rows or columns, rows get added to the bottom, columns get added to the right. Now, if you did want to add rows or columns within the table, what you would have to do is, let me actually put some more text in here. So if I wanted another row to appear between this top text row and this text row, I would put my cursor in the text row. One of the ways to do this is to come in here and choose Insert, Table Objects, and you can say Insert Row Above. So you can see that it added a row there. Or I can put my cursor here, say Insert, Table Objects, Insert Column to the left, like so. And just like you can add rows and columns, you can also delete rows and columns. So if I wanted to get rid of these bottom two rows, I would just have to select them, hit my delete key, and they're gone. Same thing with these columns, select them, delete them, they're gone. One important thing to keep in mind when deleting rows and columns is that you can only delete entire rows or columns. I can't just select a single cell like this and hit delete. Nothing's going to happen. A table has to be a rectangle. There really is no way around that. So it can't be an irregular shape where it cuts down here, cuts to the left, comes down again, and then goes across. It has to be a rectangle. So I have to either get rid of an entire row or an entire column. Now, that's not to say that a table has to be a big, boxy grid. You have the ability in HTML, and therefore in Dreamweaver, to merge cells together. For instance, let's say I wanted to add an image that covers the entire space of this first column. What I could do is drag through this entire column to select it, or just click up here to select the entire column. And down here in the Properties Inspector, there is a Merge button. And just clicking that, you can see it merges those cells together, so it's just one big cell now. The one thing you should keep in mind here is that if you have any content in these cells when you merge them, they'll all end up in that new single cell together. So it's usually better to merge empty cells together and then add your content. And of course, you can also split merge cells once you've merged them together just by clicking the Split button down here. You don't have to split them back into the original 4 rows in this case. You could split them into columns if you wanted to, or you could split them into even more rows. But we'll just set it back to the original number of rows there. And there it is. So once you've selected your cells, there's lots of things you can do, like adding background colors or images, changing the table's border size, adjusting padding and spacing. I'm going to be covering all of these topics in the upcoming movies. But in this movie, I just wanted to make sure you understood how to select different sections of the tables. One last thing I'll mention here is that while you can select sections of the table and then alter them in the Properties Inspector, you can also right-click or control-click on your selected cells or within the table to open up this contextual menu. And if you go to the Table section here, that menu contains many of the items that are available in the Properties panel. For instance, you can choose to merge cells together. If I had selected several cells, I can insert rows, insert columns. I even have this option, Insert Rows or Columns, ... which actually opens up a dialog box where I can choose how many rows or columns I want to insert and where they're going to go. I'll just cancel that. So just keep in mind that contextual menu is available to you. It might save you a little bit of time. Okay, so let's start taking a look at how to create tables that we can use to help lay out our page's content. So I'm going to be working with some new files here. If you have the exercise files available to you, I've copied the 09_tables folder to the desktop, and I'm going to need to define that as a site here in Dreamweaver. So I'm going to come in and choose Site, New Site. We'll call this one Tables, and we'll search for that folder on our desktop. And again, if you're on the Mac, you'll single-click the folder and click Choose. Here on Windows, we'll double-click to open it up and then click Select. I'm going to leave everything else here the way it is and click on OK. Right, so here are the files we're going to be working with. Now, when you insert a table, there's basically 2 different types of tables that you can insert. We have what are called percentage-based tables and pixel-based tables. If you want the content of your page to be sort of malleable, to be able to shift the text wrap or shift the position of its contents based on the size of the user's browser window, you want to create a percentage-based table. If, on the other hand, you want the content of your page to remain static, to be unchanging no matter what size the user's browser window happens to be, you want to create a pixel-based table. Now, we'll be looking at how to create a percentage-based table in the very next movie, but in this movie, we're going to start by looking at how to create a pixel-based table. I'm going to start by opening up the file text.html. Now this is just some regular text on the page. There's nothing containing it. It's just regular default looking text. I'm going to look at this in my browser for a moment. So here's the text here in Firefox. The thing about this text is it's fine. I can read it. I can get all the information that the author intended me to get from it, but it doesn't look very interesting. The other thing about this particular layout is that it's relying entirely on the browser window to control its text wrap. So if I make the browser window a little bit bigger or smaller, you can see that the text just continues to wrap within it, which is not that big a deal, but especially on a large monitor, if somebody has their window open to a larger size, it's not the easiest thing to do to read left to right, all the way back to the left, to the right, all the way back to the left, to the right, so on and so on. To give this a little bit more of a easier to read layout, it would be nice if we could actually put this text into columns. Now you can't actually create columns in HTML in the sense where you'll have text flow from one column to the other, but you can create the illusion of having columns, and we accomplish this by using tables. And I'm going to use a pixel-based table to control the content that we see here. So let's go back to Dreamweaver here, and I'm going to open up the file basic.html along with this one. This is just an empty blank page that's already been saved for us. Now I'm going to insert a table. For this exercise, I'm going to use 2 rows, 3 columns. I'm going to leave the table width set to 600 pixels. I'm going to set the border thickness of the table to 0. Now, by adding a border thickness of 0, we're basically making this an invisible table. The table will be there, it'll be able to contain everything that we put into it, but we just won't see any physical representation of the table's borders. So to the untrained eye, they won't know that there's actually a table in here. Cell padding and cell spacing I will leave untouched for now. We don't need a header row or column, so we're not going to choose any of those. And as far as the accessibility options go, we're not going to caption this table or anything like that right now. We'll talk more about accessibility when we get to the chapter on accessibility. I'm just going to leave everything the way it is and click on OK. And there's my table. So I want to contain the contents of this text page in this table. So I'm just going to start copying text over. I'm going to start with this first paragraph here. I'm going to select it, right-click or control-click, and choose Copy. You can also press Control or Command-C, or choose Edit Copy, of course. I'll go back to the basic page here, and I'm going to paste this first paragraph in the bottom cell of the second column here. Now you notice what's happened here is after I pasted it, the borders of the table in those other regions have collapsed because there's actually nothing in those cells. That's one thing about working with tables is once you put content in one of the cells, all the empty rows and columns will collapse. Now, to prevent this from happening, I'm going to click in that first row. Now, if you have trouble clicking in that first row, you might already know that if you press Tab while you're inside of a table, you'll just move a cursor from cell to cell. So I can either put my cursor here in an easy to click in cell, press Tab a couple times to end up in this bottom cell right here, or I can put it in the top cell and press Shift Tab to go backwards and put it in the very first cell there. Either way, it doesn't matter if you're in the top cell or the bottom cell, because what we're going to do here is set a width for this cell. And you can see the width and height settings down here represented by the W and H. You can't have a column with more than one width in it, so it doesn't matter whether I'm in the top cell or the bottom cell. Since this is a 600 pixel wide table, I'm just going to divide this into 3, so I'll type 200 pixels right there. I'm going to do the same thing in this column, put my cursor in there, put a width of 200. And naturally that'll leave 200 for this one, but I'm still going to put that in there so we have a numeric value in our code. Okay, so now that everything is at 200, notice that it still shifts, but once I start adding more content, things will start looking a little bit better. All right, so now I'm going to go over and get the next paragraph of text here. Copy that. Go back to basic, and I'm going to paste it in the bottom right cell. And there it is. Now this next title for this page here, From the Fields to Your Cup of History of Tea, probably is not going to fit in just one cell because I want it to be the title and I want it to be all in the top row. So let me copy that first. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to merge these two cells together. So again, I select those two cells, The merge button's down here. Now it's just one cell. And now I can paste in there. And there we go. So there's the initial layout for this page. Let's go look at this in our browser. So it's kind of resembling columns, but this doesn't look that good. There are a couple things we need to fix here. First of all, notice that the second column looks like there's a big gap here at the top of empty space. Let's go and see why this is. Now the reason for this is when you're working in a table cell, you still have the normal alignments that you're familiar with when you're working with text. You have left, center, and right. But because we're in a cell, we also have vertical alignment to deal with, which would be top, middle, and bottom. By default, anything that you put in the cell is set to align to the left side horizontally and in the middle vertically. But I want this particular cell to have all of its content start at the top. So with my cursor in this cell, I'm going to come down to the Properties Inspector, and here we have menus for horizontal alignment and vertical alignment. I'm going to change the vertical alignment from default to top. And even though it looks like this cell here has all the content starting at the top, it's actually set to middle as well. It's just because it has more content in there that it's making the table expand, so it looks like it's going all the way from top to bottom. But I like having the code in there that tells the table to make sure that this all stays in the top. So I'll choose vertical, top there as well. No visual change, but the code has actually been added at this point. And we can see that if I select the cell, look at the code, you can see it sets v-align equals top. Okay, so that looks a little bit better. Next thing you might notice is that the two text blocks are probably a little bit too close together. So let's fix that. Now, in order to fix what I need to here, I need to select the actual table because I need to get to the table's properties. And again, one of the ways you can do this is to put your cursor along the bottom of the table till you see the red line going around the entire table to select the table. And another way is with your cursor in the table, just click the table tag. Either way will bring you to the table properties in your Properties Inspector. Now in here we have cell pad and cell space. What's the difference between these two? Now, we talked a little bit about margins and padding in the chapter on CSS, and this is sort of similar. Padding is the same thing as the CSS padding we were talking about. The padding is the inside of the cell. The analogy I always like to use is imagine creating and working with tables just drives you completely crazy, and they throw you in a padded cell. Padded cells have their padding on the inside of the cell. That'll always help you remember that. Cell space, on the other hand, is the space between the cells. So let's just take a look at this. We have these dotted lines here that represent the cell walls here. So if I add some cell padding of, say, 20 pixels, notice that the text is pulled away from the walls of the cell because we've added cell padding. Let me go ahead and delete that. Cell space, on the other hand, is the space between the cells. So if I add 20 pixels there, notice that the text still stays flush to the borders of the cell, but now there's more space in between those cells. So for this particular example, I'm just going to use cell space. Let's try 5 pixels. Let's try 10 pixels. And we'll take a look and see how that looks. That, to me, is a little bit more obvious that we're working with two separate columns here. I think that looks a little bit better. Okay, so that's the difference between cell spacing and cell padding. And that's pretty much how I want my table to look. The next thing I might want to do here is just do a little bit of text formatting. I might come in here and select the text in the cell. Maybe I'll make that a size of heading 3. And we'll change the font to Verdana. I don't want the text to wrap there, so let's make that a little bit smaller. There we go. Now, I also want to bring that a little bit closer to the text down here, so I'm going to change this vertical alignment to bottom. Again, looks like I have to make that a little smaller. There we go. And if I want to format the text in both these cells together, and I've already showed you this, you can just drag through and select both of those cells. And we'll make this Verdana as well. And we'll make that a size of 14. Let's make it 12. And again, in the previous chapter, we set up our preferences to use CSS formatting, so we actually just applied CSS and it created styles for us here. which is kind of nice. Let's see how that looks. Okay, so there is my layout. If I wanted to, I could add some images here, some background colors to the page. But the point here is that we've created a pixel-based table. Notice if I move this window size around, the text stays exactly where it is. Even if I get smaller than the table itself, now I have to scroll. Because we specified that this is to be a 600 pixel wide table. And it will always be a 600 pixel wide table, no matter what size I make this window. Notice that it stays completely in place. So there you have the advantage of using a pixel-based table for your page layouts. Now, in the next movie, let's take a look at how to create a percentage-based table and when you might want to use that. In the previous movie, I showed you how to create this pixel-based table, which again lets you lock in the layout of your page and prevents the content on the page from shifting around no matter what size the user's browser window happens to be. But if you want to be a little bit more flexible and allow the user to decide how the text should flow, to some extent, you can create what's called a percentage-based table. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete this table that we created previously just by selecting it and hitting delete. And I'm going to create a new table. This table will be 2 rows, and we'll just do 2 columns for this one. I'm going to switch this to %, and we're going to set this to 75%. Now, you might be wondering, well, 75% of what? That's a good question. When you set the percentage size of a table, it's going to be 75 or whatever percent you choose of whatever's containing that table. So in this case, since this table is going right onto my page, it's going to be 75% the width of the page. If I were to put this table within another table, which is called nesting tables, which we'll do in the next movie, it would be 75 the width of whatever cell you put this table into. So notice there's no setting for table height. When you're working with tables, you're normally only concerned with the width of the table, how wide the table gets, and you just let the table get taller as necessary to contain the text or whatever content happens to be in there. Now, there are height settings in the Properties Inspector for tables, but just be aware that setting the height for a table, even though a tag exists, that's not a tag that's supported in most modern browsers, so you want to try to avoid using the height tag. All right, so I'm going to leave these current settings. I'm going to click on OK, and there it is. So I'm just going to take the same text that we brought in from the text.html document in the previous exercise. If you closed it, just remember it's sitting here in your Files panel. We'll just grab this first paragraph. I'm going to right-click or control-click on the Mac and copy that. I'm going to paste that into the first bottom cell here. Get the second paragraph. Paste that in. Oops, I didn't copy it. Let's undo that. Copy, there we go. Control V to paste. And again, I'm going to select the top row and merge those cells together. And go back and get the title. And paste that in there. Oops. All right, this actually brings up a good point. It says, cannot complete the paste. The clipboard does not contain the table cells. What this means is I actually have my table cell selected and I don't have a cursor flashing in there. So the only time you can paste once you have a table cell selected is if you copied a table cell. I only copied text, so I got to make sure I click in that cell. There I have a flashing cursor. Now I can paste. Okay, and I'll probably want to do the same things that I did previously. I'm going to select the table tag so I can select the entire table. I'm going to set a cell space of 10 to add some more space between the text there. I'm going to drag through both of these cells and set both of their vertical alignments to top. And just for the heck of it, I'll set both alignments to left, even though that's the default. All right, so there is my layout. Now, this is a percentage-based table, so let's see what this means. Let me go to my browser. So now, if I resize my browser window, notice that the text within that table also resizes. So this is really just sort of a personal decision on your part, whether you want your table, when you're laying out content, to be pixel-based or percentage-based. Sometimes you'll have a more black and white situation where you'll know that you want to make sure that nothing moves on your table. For instance, when you've set things up to be in very specific rows and columns and you don't want them to move around, you'll definitely use a pixel-based table. But if you have a page that's mostly text and you want to make sure that the user has some control over displaying your page, just put it into a percentage-based table, and based on the size of their window, this particular table in here is always going to be 75% the width of the table. And based on the width of the browser window, this particular table is always going to be 75% of its width. I'm going to go back in here just so you can see this with table selected. I'm going to turn the table border back on. Let's give it a border of 1 so you can actually see the border shifting in the browser. So you can see it there. Now it looks like at points this first cell here gets a little bit wider than the second cell. So I can fix that by clicking into the cell here, and then for the width I'm going to type 50. Now if I just type 50 it would become 50 pixels, so I'm going to put a percent sign in there to make it 50% so that it always takes up half of the table. Which naturally means this is going to take up the other 50%, but if you want to be specific about it, you can also put the value in there, just so it's written into the code. So now when I resize, you can see that they both stay 50% the width of the table. So that's a little bit about working with percentage-based tables. So far we've looked at percentage-based tables and pixel-based tables. And again, it's sort of up to you to decide which one best suits the design that you're looking to create. Now, there might also be times when you'll need to combine two different types of tables. You might need to put a pixel-based table inside a percentage-based table, or vice versa. Or you might put a pixel-based table inside a pixel-based table, or a percentage-based table inside a percentage-based table. Putting a table inside of a table is called nesting. You nest one table inside of the other. And you can do this almost infinitely. You can put tables within tables within tables within tables. But generally, if you get into designs like that, you probably have to step back and look at your design and figure out a more efficient way to lay out your page in fewer nested tables. Let's just take a look at an example of creating a nested table. I'm going to delete this table and create a new one. So for this example, I'm going to start by creating a percentage-based table, and I'm going to make this one row and just one column. So essentially, this is just going to be a single cell table. And I'm going to set this to be 100% of the browser window width. We'll leave border thickness at 0 and click on OK. So there's my single-celled table. Now, why would I want to do a single-cell 100% width table? Well, this is a common method to use if you need to have something centered on your page, or if you need to have multiple items centered on your page. You can put them all into a single-cell 100% width table. So if I want something centered in here, I'm going to come down here and choose my horizontal alignment to be center. I'm also going to choose my vertical alignment to be top because I want everything aligned to the top for this example. Now you might be wondering, well, we have choice of horizontal alignment here, but we also have choice of horizontal alignments here. Now, just as a general rule, you should always set the alignment of the cell first, and then if you need to specifically align something differently within that cell, then you can use these alignment buttons in here, and I'll show you an example of that in just a little bit. But again, I keep coming back to that rule of the specific overriding the general. The general rule for this cell right now is for everything to be aligned to the center and aligned to the top. But more on that in just a little bit. First thing I'm going to do here is grab an image. Inside my images folder, there's a file called history.jpg. I'm just going to grab that and drag that into my table cell, right from the Files panel. And we'll just call this generic image, since I'm not really doing anything with this right now. Okay, so there's a single centered image now here on my page. Now I'm going to want to add some text. So I'm going to hit Enter to go down to the next line. Let's go back to the text document. I'm just going to grab all the text in here and copy it. Go back to Basic, and I'll perform a paste. And there it is. Let's take a look at this in the browser. Now, because this is a 100% percentage-based table, notice that the text wraps to the window, but everything stays centered. Now, I kind of like the image and the heading here to be centered, but I'd really rather prefer these two paragraphs to be aligned to the left of the window. So let me come back in here. Now, this is an example of why you would first set the overall alignment of the cell, and then you can come in here and just select the areas that you want to change the alignment to. Something like that. So even though the overall rule for the cell is to have everything centered, I specifically selected these two paragraphs and aligned them to the left. So that looks a little bit better to me. But an issue I'm still having with this is that because the table is the exact width of the browser window, if I have my browser window open all the way like this, I have that problem that I was talking about earlier where I have to read all the way from the left all the way to the right and to go back and forth. And this is really a lot of text to be reading on such a large page like this. So what I like to do is control how much space the text actually has to wrap in. And I can accomplish this by nesting a table in here. And I'm going to nest a pixel-based table because I don't want the width of the table holding the text to change. So I'm just going to select all the text for the moment and just delete it. And with my cursor in here, I'm going to come up and choose my Insert Table button. And again, I'm going to create a one row, one column table, single cell table. But this time I'm going to make it a pixel-based table. And for this one, let's try a width of, say, 375 pixels. This is just a guess, but we can always go back and change this later. Okay, so there's my pixel-based table. Now I'll click into here and just paste again because I still have the original text copied. And there it is. Let's look at that. So now, everything is still centered, but no matter what size my browser window gets to, that text doesn't wrap because it's hidden inside this pixel-based table. I say hidden because the border is set to 0 and you can't see that there's actually a table there. I'm actually going to make that a little bit wider. Go back and select my table. Now notice, with my cursor inside of this table, in the HTML markup area here, I see table TRTD, table TRTD P. P for the paragraph that my cursor is currently in, T for the table cell that I'm currently in, TR for the row, TR. This is all the nested tables tags here. So notice if I click table, that selects my nested table. If I click this table, that selects my big all-encompassing table. So you can see, you can just sort of read along here and figure out where you are in terms of the HTML markup. So I'm going to select my nested table. Let's make that 450 pixels. Looks a little bit better to me. And while I'm in here, the default alignment for this table is to be aligned to the left again. You can see that. And I'll set the alignment to the top just to be safe. But I want this title here to be centered. So again, I can just select the area that I want. In fact, since this is just a paragraph, I can just have my cursor in there and click center. Preview that in my browser. And there it is. So now we have a pixel-based table nested inside a percentage-based table. So I was able to lock down the width of the text using the pixel-based table, yet I could use that larger percentage-based table to ensure that everything on this page is always centered, no matter what size the user's browser window happens to be. So there you have a practical example of nesting two tables together. Now let's take a look at some things you can do to change the appearance of your table, other than deciding whether it's going to be pixel-based or percentage-based. I'm going to go ahead and close this document. Don't need to save those changes. Leave the text document open for now because I might need that again. And we're going to open up the file called format.html. So here we have a basic table that lists different types of teas, their names, and how much they cost per quarter pound or half pound. So this is kind of a boring table to look at. It's just a regular standard table with some text in it. Now, one of the things you can do with tables is you can add background colors to the entire table itself, and you can also add background colors to the table rows. So if I wanted to add some color to this table, I would first select the table. And if you look down in the bottom section of your Properties Inspector, and again, you'll only see these properties if you have your Properties Inspector completely expanded, notice we can choose a background color. So I can come in here, I see the same color wall that I've been seeing all throughout these movies. So if I just pick a color for this, there's a color for the background. We can also choose a border color. And you can see what happens there. See how that looks in my browser. You always want to check it in your browser because, as you see, it looks quite different here than it does here in Dreamweaver. Different browsers render things like border colors a little bit differently than other browsers. Let's see how that looks in Explorer. You can see here in Explorer we do see those borders. So just something you want to be aware of, that it's just the fact that you have to live with that different browsers will render your border colors a little bit differently. Now I will show you in a little bit how you can use cascading style sheets to create more consistent borders. For now I'm just going to take these border colors off by clicking the default color there. Now in addition to setting the background color of your table, like I just said, you can also set a background color for a table cell. So let's say I wanted to make this first row a different color. So if I drag through to select that entire row, it doesn't matter whether I have a single cell that I want to change or an entire row. The options down here are the same. In the Properties Inspector, we have BG, which is our background color. So I can come in here and pick a slightly different color. I'm horrible at picking colors, as you can see. But the point here is, again, this is another example of the specific overriding the general. Even though we assign the table to have this one particular color, because I specifically selected a row, I can choose a different color for that. You can also set individual border colors for rows as well, or for cells, I should say. Now, in addition to being able to set colors, you can also set background images. So if you design a special image to go in the background of your table, you can select those as well. I don't really have any images to put in here, but just to show you how this is done, you have this background image area here, and if you have an image that you want to use, you can just point right to the file. And much like it works for a page background, an image will repeat itself left to right, top to bottom within a table. And you can see that's exactly what's going on here. That image is tiling in the background. But you can see that the color up here is covering up the background image of the table because, again, the row has specifically been assigned a particular color, and that's overriding the background of the table. But of course, I could select that row and add a background image to that as well. And doesn't that look lovely? So I'm just going to get rid of all that. Let me select the table again. Get rid of that. And let me just set these back to the default color again, which is no color. I'll get rid of that picture. Okay. So if you're as color challenged as I am, there is still hope. If you want to add some color to your table and you're not quite sure what to do with it, fortunately for people like me, if I have my table selected and I come up to the Commands menu, there's a great command in here called Format Table. So in this window, you can choose from some pre-designed color schemes. As I click through here, you can see a preview of them over here on the right. And there's some good ones in here, especially if you have a table in which you need to display data. You just click through, see what they look like. If you find one that you like, all you have to do is click Apply. And you'll see it not only formatted the color, but it also did things like it centered the first column here and changed the color of the text in here so that it would show up properly against this darker color. And you can see everything that it's going to do just by looking in here. It says row colors, what the first row is going to be, what the second color is going to be, and it alternates every other row, or I can tell it not to alternate every 2 rows, every 3, every 4, so on and so on. The top row of a table is often used as some sort of heading row, so which is why you have a selection here. If you want to make any type of changes to that, you can come in here, say you don't want those things to be centered. You can say what style you want them to be in, bold, italicized, or bold and italic, text color, background color. And sometimes the left column is used as headings as well, so you can change those. And you can also set a table border. You also have the option here of applying the attributes to the TD or the cell tags instead of the table row tags. And this is just a different way to end up with the same thing, but to write the code slightly differently so that the attributes are assigned to the row instead of to the individual cells. Now, if you applied them to the individual cells, that would actually add more code, so I suggest you keep that unchecked. But once you set them, you can always come back in, hit Apply again, and pick a different one. You can see it pretty much does it immediately. So once you find a format that you can live with, you can always click OK and then come in here and make any changes that you would like. So if I wanted to come in here and select that top row and set the horizontal alignment to center, I could do that. I could select everything and change it to Verdana. Set the size to 12 or whatever you want it to do. So it's still questionable whether it's a great color scheme, but it's much better than something I could have come up with. So that's how you can use the commands menu here to format your table. Now you notice that it's currently grayed out, so don't let that catch you. In order to select that command, you have to have your table selected first. Then you can come up here and choose Commands, Format Table. All right, let's take a look at another feature of working with tables in Dreamweaver that can make your life a lot easier. If you work with Microsoft Excel or some other spreadsheet program and you often need to bring data from those programs into a web page, you're really going to like this feature. Programs like Excel offer the ability to export the data from their spreadsheets in what's called tab-delimited format. And this basically is a simple text file, but each of the columns are separated with a tab, just like the tab key on your keyboard. A program like Dreamweaver is able to recognize where those tabs appear and will automatically place everything into neat rows and columns for you, right into a regular HTML table. In my exercise folders here, there's a file in here called tab-delimited. Let me just open that up in the WordPad here to show what that looks like. And I'm going to make sure I word wrap this. Actually, that doesn't look very good in WordPad. Let's open that up in a different program. Let's go to Accessories. Let's open up WordPad. That'll be able to give us a little bit better idea of what we're looking at here. If you're on a Mac and you want to look at this file, you can open it up in TextEdit. Okay, so out on my desktop, inside Chapter 9, make sure I'm looking for all documents. There's the file. Okay, that looks a little bit better. So you can see this is just a regular text file. Each line of text has a series of tab breaks in them. So it's just a regular plain old text file, but Dreamweaver can handle this in a very convenient way for us. I'm just going to go ahead and delete the table that we looked at in the last movie. Now to bring in this data, I'm going to go to the Insert menu, Table Objects, and choose Import Tabular Data. That opens up this dialog box here, and the first thing it's asking for is where is the data file. So I'm going to browse for that. It's actually right here in my Chapter 9 folder called tab-delimited. Open that up. So there's the file. Next it's asking what delimiter is being used. Now by far, having tabs in there is the most common delimiter, but you'll notice if I click this menu, we also can choose from commas, semicolons, colons, and other. If we choose other, we can actually put the character in here. But in this case, I am choosing a tab. Next we have a table width selection. We can either fit it to the data or choose set to. Fit to data will create a table that's just large enough to contain all the data, so everything will fit right into the table. Or if I want to, depending on the design that I'm going for, I can set it to fit in a certain size table, whether it be a percentage-based table or a pixel-based table. And we can also choose our cell padding, cell spacing. If I need to format the top row as a header of some sort, I can do that. Maybe I'll do that. And we can also choose whether we want a border. We can change all of these things later on as far as table width and everything down here because it's just going to be a regular table. So I'll click on OK, and there it is. There is my table. So again, if I did want to change this with the table selected, I could come in here and say I want this to be a pixel-based table, and I want it to be 550 pixels wide. And there it is. So now I just have a regular table, and just like I did in the last movie, I could go to the Commands menu, go to the Format table, Command, pick a scheme here, apply it, or do whatever. But that's how you bring in tabular data into Dreamweaver. You can see it's a big time saver over having to manually create the table and then manually type in all this information. A couple of movies back, I showed you how, let me just select my table here, you could select background colors and a border color for your tables, but we also saw that setting a border color is not the most consistent thing across different browsers. Just in my examples of showing Firefox and Internet Explorer, those borders look pretty different. Let me show you that again. I'm going to revert this file back to its original saved version and lose all my previous changes. So if I have this table selected, and I add a border color. Here's how it looks in Dreamweaver. If I look at it in Firefox, here's how it looks in Firefox. You can kind of see just the very outside of it is colored. I don't know if you can see that in this movie. If I look at it in Internet Explorer, there's something altogether different as well. It looks more like what I see here in Dreamweaver. So you can see it's kind of inconsistent. If you want to definitely have a border around your table, I suggest you use cascading style sheets. So let me show you how we can set something like this up. I'm going to set the border color back to nothing again. And I'm also going to set the border setting to 0 because I don't want Dreamweaver to create the border for me. I'm actually going to draw some borders myself. So over here to Style Sheets, I'm going to create a new style. And we'll just make this one local to this document only, an internal style sheet like we were doing in the chapter on style sheets. I'm going to redefine a tag. And let's redefine the table tag. That's the tag that's used to put a table on your page. And I'm going to go to the border category. And for the border, let's see, we'll do the same for all the way across to start out with. So for the style, let's do a solid line. For the width, we'll just do a thin line. And we'll pick a color. Click on OK. And because I applied that style to a table tag, anything that's using the table tag automatically has that style now. Let's go look at this. Here it is in Firefox. Here it is in Explorer. So it's really just that easy, but you notice that it only puts that border around the entire table. What if I want these cell separations in here? Well, let's see. Let's go back and create another rule. This time I'm going to add a CSS rule to the table cells themselves. And that's the TD tag. It stands for table data, and that's how you make a table cell in HTML. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to go to border. We'll do a solid, thin line. And I'll just pick a different color here so you can see the difference. Click on OK. And there it is. Let's take a look at that in the browser. Okay, so you can see that it added a border around each one of these cells. Now, the problem here, at least the way I see it, is that we have these sort of double borders. Because each cell has its own rectangle, we have all these spaces in here. So what I could do is try to get rid of the space between these cells. So let's go in here. I'll select the entire table and go to cell space. Now you notice cell space has nothing in it, yet there is space between these cells. There's a big difference between having nothing in this field and actually having a 0 in this field. 0 means you want absolutely no space in there. If you have nothing in there, it's going to put a little bit of cell space in there. Same thing goes for cell pad. So with 0 in there, I'll press enter. And now all those spaces have gone away and those lines have come together. But now my problem is those lines have gotten a little bit thicker than I wanted them to be. See if that shows up any better in Explorer. See if you can see that. Yeah, especially in Explorer here, because there's borders around each one of these individual cells, now that there's no space, they're sort of overlapping each other, and now I have these super thick lines, even though I only wanted thin lines. What I really want is a single color going all the way around my table, and I want it to be a single thin line. I don't want a thicker line like this. So, this requires just a little bit of thinking. What's the best way to do something like this? Well, because I have a border around the entire cell, of course they're going to overlap. The trick here is to figure out a way to make them not overlap. And the first time I tried to figure this out, it took me a little bit of sitting there. The way I like to do it is what I do is I create a style for the table cells that just creates a border on the left and the bottom of the table cell. The left and the bottom. So let's take a look and see what happens there. I'm just going to start fresh. I'm going to delete these styles I already created. Oops, select it first. There we go. Okay, let's create a new style. I'm going to apply this to the TD tag again. I'm going to go back to border. This time it's not going to be the same for all. I'm only going to apply this to the left-hand side. It's going to be solid, and it's going to be thin, and we'll pick this color here. That's the left side, and we're also going to do the same thing for the bottom. Solid, thin, same exact color. Everything else we're going to leave empty here. I'm going to click on OK, and right away you can see, at least in the browser here, now I'm getting a little bit closer to what I actually want. Because everything's just left and bottom, they all just fit together like this, and it looks like it's all continuous. The only thing I'm missing is the cap on this that's going to cover the top and the right-hand side. So what I'm going to do there, because I can't apply another style just to those TD tags unless I create a class style, but that's kind of more work than I need to do right now. I'm going to create another CSS rule, and this time I'm going to apply the style to the table tag. Same thing here, but this time I'm going to apply this style to the top and the right-hand side. So we'll go solid, solid, thin, thin, and again that same color. So I've set it up so that the table has a thin maroon border across the top and the right-hand side. Click on OK, and there it is. So this is exactly what I wanted. So I have a nice thin border around my entire table and all of its cells. Now, if you wanted to do things like not having this bottom line here, you just wanted to have vertical lines, you could just not create a style for the bottom border. It's something you'd have to play around with, but this is the basic principle of using CSS to create borders around your table. The one thing you do want to be careful about here is if I have my table selected, the only way this is really working the way I want it to is because I have my cell space set to 0. If I have that empty, remember that adds space. And with cell space in there, I'm going to have some breakage here. And here you can actually see all those different styles. Let me go back and exaggerate that. Let me add a cell space of 5. So here you can see how those different cells are being put together. But because of the space, I have this separation in here. So the only way this is really going to work is if your cell space is set to 0. If you do want some more space in here, this is where you're going to want to use padding. You can put as much padding in there as you want because this is the space inside the cells. So you can see I was able to make it bigger, yet everything is still fitting together very nicely. So that's just an example of how you can use CSS to create your table borders. That gives you the basic foundation that you need to know. If you want to do something slightly different than this, just sort of take what I've shown you here and just try to figure out how you're going to create the borders around your table cells to accomplish what you need to accomplish. One of the things about tables that some people have a problem with is that they're always rectangular. I mentioned earlier that tables always have to be a rectangle. But there are some ways to sort of trick the viewer into thinking that your table is actually rounded, or to at least give the appearance of a rounded table. So in this example, I'd like to show you a way to do this. Now, this requires that you actually have the ability to make some very basic images. And that's something that we're not going to be covering in this tutorial, working with images, creating images. But we have provided some images for you if you have access to the exercise files. And they're not that difficult to make. Let me show you what I'm talking about. In the Assets panel for this site, if I go to Images, make sure we scan here. Oops, I'm in my favorites section here. Don't let this fool you, because I was like, why do I not have any images in here? Because I'm looking at favorites, and I haven't set any favorites here. So let's go back to Site. There we go. So here we have some pre-created images called bottom left, bottom right, top left, and top right. And these are just images that look like the rounded corners of a rectangle. And we're going to put these into a table to make a nice looking rounded table into which you can add images or text or whatever you like. So again, you kind of have to know how to create these. If you're interested in learning how to work with images, I suggest you check out our Fireworks training titles or our Photoshop training titles. Lots of good information in there on how to create images like this. All right, so let's just go ahead. I'm just going to delete this table in here, and I'm going to create a new table. For this example, we're going to create a table that has 3 rows, 3 columns. We want this table to be flexible so we can add as much content to it as we like. So I'm going to make this a percentage-based table, and we'll make it a 75% table. Border thickness will be 0. We'll also set cell padding and cell spacing to 0 right off the bat. Okay, so there is my table. Oops. I'm still using the style sheets from the previous one that I created, so I'm going to delete those. because I applied them to the tags, it automatically applied to the table that I entered. So I'm just going to get rid of these styles I created in the previous movie. Okay, here we go. I'm going to start by clicking in this upper left-hand corner cell, and down here in the Properties Inspector, I'm going to set the horizontal option to left, even though that's its default, and I'm going to set the vertical option to top. From my Assets panel, I'm going to find the top left image here. I'm just going to drag that in there. I'm not going to bother with the alternate text for this example, so I'm just going to click Cancel. Now I'll go into the upper right cell. I'm going to set its alignment to right, and again, vertical alignment to top. This just ensures that the images I insert into the cell are aligned to the upper right corner. So I'm going to grab the upper right image, topright.gif. Just cancel that again. So you can just see I'm building the corners in this table. So in the lower left-hand corner, we'll set this to left and to bottom. And I'll find bottom left. And one more, click to the lower right. This will be set to right and bottom. And we'll put in bottom right. Okay, so the stage is just about set. Now, if you look at my table, I've got a cell here, 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 here. The content of my table is all going to go in the center cell. These other corner cells are basically just there to hold those corner pieces. So I'm going to come into this top cell in the middle here, and for the width, I'm going to type in 100%, which you might think is kind of weird because obviously it's not going to take up 100% because there are things in these cells already, and you can't make a cell that has content and it collapse into nothing. But because I'm putting 100% in here, that ensures that this middle column will go flush to the corner pieces here. Now I'm going to select this entire column, and I'm going to set a background color for it. So I'm going to click its background color well, and I'll just sample one of these corner pieces, like so. And I'll also click in that cell, sample that same color, and this cell, and sample that same color. And there is my rounded corner table. If I go and look at this, because it's a percentage-based table, you can see it resizes itself like so. So if I wanted to come back in here, grab some text, copy it, put it right in the middle cell, there it is. I want to make that a little bit easier to read, like so. So in my browser, I have what looks like a rounded corner table with text that flows within it. Of course, if I wanted to have text that stayed static in it, I could always nest a pixel-based table in that middle cell and put the text in there. But this is a kind of a neat trick to make the objects on your page a little less rectangular and boxy, which is oftentimes a problem with web pages. Things just look a little bit too boxy. So by adding a table with rounded corners in it, you can just make things look a little bit nicer on your page.